video clip. Okay, the video is going. And of course I forgot to check whether it's recording from the right channel, so got to make sure. It's probably not. Oh, it is. Interesting, very good. So it somehow kept the settings all by itself, so it remembers, if I connect this particular microphone, it would automatically choose that as the input device. Very nice. Okay, so we are ready to go. First thing first, homework assignment first. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at the homework assignment, and and I'll give you guys the solution. So this way, at least you know what is right, what it is supposed to be, and why that is the case. So we'll start with that.
I do have a question before you start.
Go ahead.
On one of the other homework assignments I turned in, all I got from you was C solution.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean I didn't get anywhere near right? Is that what that means?
That usually means it is, yeah, it usually means it's kind of far, from the solution. It's not too close to the solution, so it's really hard to.
It was exactly like his answer. That's what got me confused, because when I went over it, I swear it was exactly the same answer as yours.
Well, if that's the case, you should let me know, and I can take a second look at the solution
again.
again.
I'm not worried about it now. I was just looking earlier and happened to see that.
Okay. All right. So we'll go ahead and save the file before I can modify it. We only have a few more weeks to go. Is it 2 weeks? Just about. Okay. And let's go ahead and take a look at the trace of this program. The code is, really simple, and that's usually what worries you the more. Is the code seems easy. But this one should not be a long trace, Yep, go ahead.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Last time, does it mean that you're doing one recursion after the other, and then followed by the other one? Or do you do both at once?
You can only invoke one subroutine at one time, so you cannot invoke both of them at once.
I was thinking because of the last.
No, you have to do one, then the other. Okay, well, we'll take a look today because, that's exactly what we'll go over first. Okay. So line number 3 there's nothing to say because we don't have any global variables. The main program is over here. It invokes the subroutine called S3, passing 2 to parameter n. And in the subroutine, we check whether n is 0 or not. If n is 0, it returns 1. If n is not 0, in this case, if it is positive, it will invoke the subroutine again, passing n minus 1 to n. So each time you do the recursion, n decrements by 1. So eventually it will get to 0, and then it returns 1. So what we want to do is to find out exactly what this program is supposed to do, and then because it's just basically, it's really similar to some of the examples we have gone through in the class, particularly Fibonacci numbers. The Fibonacci number is only different because this part is different. It has 2 cases to check, and then the recursion is also different because we pass n minus 1 to 1, and then we pass n minus 2 to the other one in Fibonacci. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started with this program. The first line to execute is line 12, which is the only line outside of the definition of a subroutine. And that is basically because I want to make sure that what we teach in this class is consistent with C and C++ programming. On line 12, we invoke main. Main in this case has no local variable, so it makes it pretty easy to set up because it only needs one column. Column C needs a return line number, and the return line number is just post because line 12 is the last line of the program already. So basically column C won't be needed for a while. We can actually hide this column for the time being. And I can do that by changing the scroll boundary. So this way we can just not see column C at all. Okay. On line 10, after we set up column C, we go to line 10, which is the only line inside the main subroutine. It is a print statement, but in addition to being a print statement, it wants to print the result returned by the invocation of S3. So that means we have to invoke S3 first before we print the value returned by the invocation. So we have to use column D to indicate the return info in this case. We need return info instead of return line number because the subroutine invoked in this case, which is S3, returns a value. So by the time we get back onto line 10 in this case, we have to figure out, okay, what else do we have to do on that line? So the return info is going to be set up like this. We have to remember we have to go back to line 10, but by the time we go back to line 10, we only have a number, a value to print. And that's what the question mark is there for. It is just there to replace the value that should be printed when we get back onto that line. We also have to set up one more thing because subroutine S3 has one parameter n. So we'll allocate another column to remember the parameter n. N is passed by value. There are two indications why it is, or how, there are two indications that it is passed by value. If you look into the definition of the subroutine, we say by val n, which means it is passed by reference. But if you look at the arrow, it is a single-sided right arrow, which also suggests that it is a pass by value parameter.
Doesn't by value mean passed by value?
It is passed by value. Yep, this one is passed by value. In this case, it has its own value. Now, this is one thing, that I want to point out with the previous homework assignment. When you have passing by reference, you don't change the parameter itself. But in this case, we have a pass by value parameter. So we can change column E if we want to, but the code does not do that. Once we set up column D and column E, we go into the subroutine. The first line that has any action to perform is line 3. So we go to line 3. And line 3 is the evaluation of a condition. Does n equal to 0? In this case, it is false because n has a value of 2, and therefore n equals to 0 is false. If the condition is false, we do not execute the then branch. We go to the else branch, which means the next line to execute is line 6. Line 6 looks somewhat confusing because it is a return statement, and on top of that, it has two invocations on the same return statement. Well, it doesn't matter because what we have to do is to say, okay, now we need to perform this statement. I don't know what to return until I know what both invocations are returning. As a result, I cannot return just yet. I have to invoke S3, and there are two invocations in this case. In other words, even though the parameters look exactly the same, you cannot just say, oh, I'll just invoke the left-hand side and assume the right-hand side has exactly the same value. Why can't we make that assumption? In general, in this program, it does return the same value. But in general, why can't we assume, because the left-hand side invokes S3 with n minus 1, passing to n, and the same thing on the right-hand side. So how come we cannot make the assumption that they must be returning exactly the same value? Go ahead.
Is it because the n variable could change somehow? And so
in this case, it cannot change because n is passed by value,
right,
which means whatever happens to the parameter n does not happen to my n. Okay, because the new parameter is a copy of n minus 1. It has to do with the content of subroutine S3 may involve, let's say, changing or accessing a global variable. Okay, if S3 in this case does change and access a global variable, then the invocation, two different invocations, even though with the same parameters, can result in a different result. Okay. The other possible reason is S3 may actually involve asking the end user to input a number. You cannot be sure that the user will input exactly the same number in both invocations. So as a general rule, you cannot make the assumption that it will return exactly the same value. Based on that assumption, that means we have to invoke one first, get the result, then we have to invoke the second one, even though both, in this case, would give you exactly the same value. So that means, on line 6, we have to set up return info again. Oops, wrong window. We have to set up return info, And return info in this case will say that after we invoke S3, we have to go back to line 6. Line 6 still has the following to do. It has to return whatever value is returned by that invocation and add to it the result of the other invocation. In other words, I'm not done with the second invocation after the first one. I have to deal with the second one separately. Are there any questions about this step? Any questions about that step? Okay. And on top of the return info column, we also have to pass n along. The new n is n minus 1, okay? And the current n has a value of 2, so the new one is going to be a 1. Yep.
Does it matter if we do one side, the right-hand side, or the left-hand side first?
I won't take any points off. The convention is reading from left to right, so traditionally speaking, most programming languages will invoke the left one first and then the right one. In this case, obviously, it does not matter which one you invoke because in both cases, they return the same value. Okay. So once we set up the columns, we go back into the subroutine starting on line 3, and we check again. N equals to 0. Once again, it's false because this time n equals to 1. Then we go to line 6, which is the else case, and once again, line 6 wants to, execute this statement again, and once again, we have to set it up pretty much the same way. So what I'll do is I'll just copy and paste it, and then change n to 0 this time, because this time my n has a value of 1, which means the next n, which is n minus 1, has a value of 0. N minus 1 has a value of 0. So this becomes my current context at this point. Control is transferred back to the first line that has any action in the subroutine, which is line 3. And it will do exactly the same thing. N equals to 0 in this case is true because n does have a value of 0. If that is true, we go to the then branch, which is line 4. Line 4 is pretty easy. It returns a constant of 1. Okay? But it doesn't really matter whether the return statement is complicated or simple, because all it does is to copy and paste the return info cell and replace the single question mark with the value that you're returning. In this case, the value that we are returning is simply 1, so we just replace it with 1. Are we doing okay so far with? Yep.
Why the invoke statement in the return invoke?
Sorry?
Why keeping the rest of the invoke, like the additional added invoke in S3?
Because that's the second portion. I'm not even going to deal with it until it is time to deal with it. I can only handle one invocation every time, and I choose to deal with the one that is on the left-hand side first. Okay? So when we're done with this, you will see how it all ends. After line 4, we are done with the entire conditional statement. Then we go to line 8, which is the end of the subroutine. And as usual with the end of a subroutine, we just mark the entire, both columns in this case will be marked deallocated. And control will go back to line 6 because the return info tells me that I have to go back to line 6. Now here's the tricky part. The next line after row 15 of the trace is row 16. On row 16 of the trace, we're back to line 6. But when we're back to line 6 does not look like the line 6 of the pseudocode anymore because the left-hand side or the invocation on the left-hand side is already done. So we are only left with this much to evaluate, which means we have to deal with the right-hand side in this case. Furthermore, the context is now back to here. This is my current context